Do you think you know everything about Apollo 21 and Neil Armstrong? The truth is, NASA and the US government may have hidden a mind-blowing secret for over half a century. In this video, Tales Mythology takes you through classified archives, erased testimonies, and chilling mysteries that still shock the world today. A mysterious luminous figure appeared on the moon, and it may have changed humanity's understanding of the universe forever. Don't miss out on the shocking truth behind Apollo 21, why mankind never returned to the moon, secret files waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Tales Mythology now and never miss another mystery of history and the cosmos. The moon lay silent, as it had 4 eons, a cold sentinel watching the earth below. Its pale surface caught the distant sunlight, turning craters into shadows and valleys into silver scars. Humanity had always looked up and seen nothing but mystery. Yet in the summer of 1974, when Apollo 21 descended through its thin exosphere, what awaited the astronauts was not emptiness, but something that would twist the boundaries of faith, science, and reason. The landing itself was mechanical perfection, thrusters pulsing, descent engine flaring, dust rising in a slow-motion storm around the landing struts. But inside the module, beneath the clipped, calm voices of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, there ran a current of something unspoken. Armstrong felt it first, not a sound, not even a sight at first, but a presence, the way a forest seems alive when you know unseen eyes are watching. For the world back home, the cameras show triumphant astronauts, heroic and untouchable. What they never saw, what they were never meant to see, was the way Armstrong's voice lowered on a private channel when he muttered words that would later be erased from history. "It's watching us." Those words, transcribed by Mission Control before being cut from public records, became the first thread in a tapestry of secrecy that has lasted half a century. NASA would later classify it under the sterile term phenomenon alpha, burying witness reports beneath layers of jargon and sealed archives. But for Armstrong, the test pilot, the engineer, the man of numbers and reason, what unfolded on that barren lunar plain was neither accident nor optical illusion. It was an encounter, and it terrified the most powerful men on Earth. In Washington, President Richard Nixon had staked his reputation on Apollo 21. It was to be the crowning jewel of American dominance in space after the turbulence of Vietnam and Watergate. He wanted triumph, certainty, control. What he got instead were whispers, fragments of astronaut testimony, coded transmissions, a shaken flight surgeon whose medical logs did not match the public interviews. The astronauts had returned alive, but they had not returned alone. Armstrong, though never prone to superstition, wrote one line in his private notes the night after splashdown. The moon was not empty. It was a temple. Those words were found years later in a sealed folder, his handwriting steady, but his meaning shrouded. A temple to what? No one could say. But the men in dark suits who questioned him behind closed doors made one thing clear. Some truths, they said, were too dangerous for the world to know. And so began a silence thicker than the void of space itself, a silence Armstrong carried to his grave. This was not the story told in classrooms or newsreels. The official version remained one of courage, science, and progress. But behind the curtain, Apollo 21 had revealed something that defied explanation. A luminous figure on the horizon, motionless yet alive, watching the astronauts with a stillness that was almost human and yet not. It did not approach. It did not speak. It simply was. Armstrong would later describe the sensation as being measured by eternity itself. Buzz Aldrin, in a rare unguarded moment years afterward, told a journalist off camera, "It looked at us the way a teacher looks at a student about to fail a lesson he doesn't even know he's taking." NASA, of course, denied everything. But denials, like shadows, only prove there is something blocking the light. Long before Apollo 21's descent toward the Sea of Tranquility, another descent was already unfolding, one into secrecy, power, and fear. The early 1970s were not kind to the American psyche. The optimism of the space age, the dream of a giant leap for mankind, had collided with the brutal weight of the Vietnam War, civil unrest, and the unraveling of trust in government. Watergate had cracked the facade of presidential infallibility. The Cold War cast long, icy shadows over every political decision, and in the middle of it all stood President Richard Nixon, a man both brilliant and paranoid, who believed power meant control of information, of perception, of history itself. When the reports from Apollo 21 first crossed his desk, fragments of astronaut testimony, hinting at something unexplainable on the moon, Nixon did not react with wonder. He reacted with fear. For Nixon, this was not about science. It was about what knowledge does to nations. The United States was already walking a tightrope of Cold War tensions. The Cuban Missile Crisis had nearly ended the world a decade earlier. Spy satellites now circled the Earth, nuclear submarines prowled the oceans, and politicians spoke in measured tones about peace, while stockpiling enough atomic fire to burn civilization into ash. Now imagine, into that world of suspicion and trembling balances of power, came news that something not human had appeared before American astronauts. Not Soviet, not Chinese, not earthly, something beyond all of them. It would have shattered the Cold War chessboard overnight. Nixon understood this immediately, and so did his advisors, men who lived in the shadows of intelligence agencies, men who knew the power and danger of information. Armstrong and Aldrin were still in quarantine after splashdown when orders came from Washington. The details of the encounter to remain sealed under national security protocols. No public disclosure without presidential authorization. In plainer language, this never happened. You will never speak of it. Behind closed doors, the astronauts were debriefed by men who never gave their names, who wore no NASA badges, who asked about the luminous figure on the lunar horizon with the same cold tone they might use for a missile launch. They weren't interested in science. They were interested in control. One official reportedly asked Armstrong, "Did it communicate? Did it show intent?" Armstrong answered carefully, "It didn't need to. Its presence was enough." That line was underlined in the debrief transcript. Then the page vanished into a classified archive. Nixon himself never spoke publicly of Apollo 21 beyond the usual patriotic speeches. He smiled for cameras, shook the astronauts' hands, praised America's technological might. But aides recalled seeing him alone for one closed-door briefing, sitting in silence, his face pale, his knuckles white against the arm of his chair. One whispered to another, "He looks like a man who's just learned God is real and isn't on his side." From that day forward, the lunar encounter was buried beneath layers of classification, sealed tighter than nuclear launch codes. Even the phrase Phenomenon Alpha, NASA's own sterile term, disappeared from official documents by the end of the decade. The message was clear. Some truths would remain secrets, even if they could rewrite the story of humanity itself. Meanwhile, the public saw only what they were allowed to see: ticker tape parades, magazine covers, Armstrong smiling modestly as schoolchildren waved flags. They never saw the footage that technicians whispered about grainy frames of something luminous moving at the edge of the landing site. Its shape humanoid yet vast, like a figure woven from the fabric of starlight itself. That film, if it still exists, remains locked away in some forgotten vault, labeled with codes only a handful of people alive could decipher. Nixon's America was a world where truth served politics, not the other way around. And in that world, what happened on the moon in 1974 was not wonder. It was threat, because if humanity was being watched by something greater than itself, then no government, no military, no empire truly controlled the story of Earth. And for men like Nixon, control was everything. Armstrong once wrote in a private note, years later, "They told me silence was for the good of the world, but I think it was for the good of their world, the one built on power, not truth." Those words, like so much else, never made it into the history books, but they remain fragments of a reality too big for the age of secrets that tried to bury it. The landing should have been routine. That was the cruel irony of it all. 4 years. NASA engineers had practiced this moment to perfection. Simulations ran endlessly. Flight crews rehearsed in mock-up lunar modules until they could recite procedures like prayers. And on July 27, 1974, Apollo 21 descended toward the barren sea of tranquility with the precision of clockwork. At least, that's what the public saw. Inside the cramped lunar module, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin moved with calm efficiency. Their voices over comms were steady, almost boring, the tone of professionals unfazed by history. Throttle down. Roger. We're stable. Altitude 200 feet, velocity nominal. But beneath the clipped language of astronauts lived a tension no checklist could resolve. The first sign came when Aldrin, scanning the horizon through a porthole, froze. "Neil," he said quietly, switching to the private channel NASA rarely discussed publicly. "Do you see that?" Armstrong looked. At first, it seemed like a trick of sunlight, the glare off lunar dust. Then it moved, not quickly, not slowly, but with a kind of deliberation, as though aware it was being watched. A luminous figure stood at the edge of a distant crater, glowing faintly against the endless black sky. Its shape was humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too still, almost woven from the light itself, like the silhouette of something only half in this world. Armstrong didn't speak. He couldn't. The landing. When the lunar module touched down, history was supposed to be made. Flags planted, rocks collected, humanity triumphant. But in that moment, Armstrong felt none of it. He would later write in his private journal, a journal NASA confiscated after his death, "I stepped onto the surface of the moon, and it stepped into me." As Armstrong made the famous descent down the ladder, cameras rolling, millions watching on Earth, he kept glancing toward the horizon. The figure did not move closer, did not retreat. It simply watched. Armstrong's pulse remained steady, something NASA's medical officers later found remarkable. No panic, no disorientation, no signs of hallucination. Whatever he was seeing, it was real enough to remain calm for. The first encounter, on the private channel, Aldrin whispered, "It's still there." Armstrong replied, voice low, "I see it." The words never appeared in official transcripts. They were cut, replaced with meaningless chatter about surface dust density and windless silence. But years later, a retired NASA communications tech claimed he heard it live, that his supervisors ordered him to forget it before the recording vanished into a classified archive. "They told me it was an optical anomaly," the man said decades later. But optical anomalies don't look like they're breathing. For nearly 10 minutes, the presence remained. Not walking, not floating, something in between, as though physics itself bent to accommodate it. Armstrong would later describe the sensation not as fear, but as being examined. In one debriefing notes later shredded, he told NASA psychologists, "It didn't threaten us. It didn't welcome us. It simply regarded us like a teacher watching children play with matches." The astronauts collected samples, conducted experiments, performed as though nothing unusual had occurred, because they knew the cameras were always watching. But their eyes kept drifting back to that crater's edge, to the silent figure bathed in faint, unnatural light. It never crossed the boundary between them. It didn't need to. The return to silence. When Apollo 21 prepared to leave the lunar surface, Armstrong looked one last time toward the horizon. The figure was gone. No tracks, no trace, nothing but the ancient dust of the moon, undisturbed for millennia. But Armstrong knew what he had seen. So did Aldrin, and so did the men in the windowless rooms of NASA headquarters when they reviewed the telemetry data, the faint background signals, the subtle camera frames where a figure of light stood watching history unfold. Years later, when fragments of Armstrong's personal notes surfaced, one line appeared again and again. "It saw us, and it changed everything." But the change would not come through revelation. It would come through silence. Because as soon as Apollo 21 returned to Earth, the men in suits took over. The mission's scientific triumph became public history. Its unearthly encounter became buried legend. Long after the landing, Neil Armstrong would be asked what he remembered most about Apollo 21. He never said the words people expected. Not the first step, not the American flag, not mission accomplished. He always paused before answering, as though weighing what he could say against what he wasn't allowed to. Sometimes, after long silences, he would simply murmur, the feeling of being watched, an encounter beyond physics. Armstrong had flown experimental jets through storms at the edge of the atmosphere. He had ejected from a burning test plane seconds before it shattered into flame. He had stared death in the face at Mach 3. But nothing prepared him for the silent figure on the moon. It wasn't only the sight of it, it was the sense of it. He later described it as a pressure without weight, a presence that pressed against the edges of his mind without sound, without movement, without threat, but with absolute certainty. It was alive, he told NASA's flight surgeon privately, but not the way we are alive. Some in NASA called it hallucination, some called it stress, but Armstrong's biometrics told a different story. Heart rate steady, blood pressure normal, voice calm. If he was hallucinating, his body didn't know it. The thing that watched, Aldrin said it looked humanoid. Armstrong disagreed. He said it looked like a shape borrowed from humanity for convenience, as though whatever intelligence animated it had chosen an appearance they might understand the way a parent kneels to speak to a child. No sound came from it, no movement beyond slow, deliberate shifts like a shadow, choosing to stay half in light, half in darkness. But both men felt the same thing. It was observing them, measuring them, not with hostility, not even with curiosity, but with something colder, something deeper, like a scientist watching lab rats trying to light a campfire. The words erased. During the debriefing, Armstrong mentioned the sensation of being studied. The man across the table, a colonel with a face carved from stone, stopped taking notes. Within hours, the transcript of that session was edited. Phrases disappeared, sentences replaced with unintelligible notations. Armstrong's words about the presence became ambient light reflection anomaly in official records. The colonel told him quietly, "For national security, Commander, you understand." But Armstrong didn't understand. Not then. Psychological ripples. In the weeks after the mission, Armstrong's wife, Janet, noticed the change. He still smiled for cameras, still gave speeches about courage, exploration, destiny. But at night, she would find him sitting alone on the porch, staring at the moon for hours. When she asked what he was thinking, he only said, "It wasn't empty, Janet. That's all I can tell you." What NASA knew. Rumors spread quietly through NASA corridors. A few technicians claimed they saw frames of film that didn't appear in the official archives, frames showing something luminous near the landing site. Most laughed it off as conspiracy talk, but one man, a communications officer, told a journalist decades later, "I saw it on the monitor before they cut the feed. It wasn't glare, it wasn't dust, it was something standing there, looking at them like it was waiting for us to notice." Then he stopped talking, because even after 30 years, he was still under oath. Armstrong's private notes. In 1975, Armstrong wrote a single line in a notebook that would be locked away until after his death. It looked at us the way eternity looks at a mayfly. The note had no date, no context, just that single sentence, and those who read it decades later felt a chill. It was impossible to explain. Disappearance into silence. By 1976, NASA had ordered all mission logs from Apollo 21 sealed under national security classification. Publicly, the mission remained a triumph. Privately, it became a ghost story, because the men who had seen the figure were growing older and quieter, and the thing on the moon, whatever it was, had left no trace but memory. The day Apollo 21 splashed down in the Pacific, it was celebrated as a triumph. Cameras caught everything, the capsule bobbing in the waves, Navy divers swimming out to secure it, Armstrong climbing into the helicopter with a tired but victorious smile. The news anchors spoke of courage, technology, the human spirit. No one mentioned the luminous figure on the moon. They never would. The first step into silence. Within hours, the astronauts were moved into quarantine facilities, standard procedure to prevent possible lunar contamination. Though no one truly believed the moon carried germs, But this quarantine had a second purpose. It isolated Armstrong and Aldrin from the press, from their families, from anyone who might ask the wrong questions before the government had time to tighten its grip on the story. Behind those locked doors, interviews were conducted by men who never gave their full names. Some wore NASA badges, others did not. One of them carried a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Another wore a military uniform with no insignia. They asked about the encounter in cold, precise tones, as though collecting data for something far larger than a space mission report. When Armstrong described the luminous figure watching from the crater's edge, the man with the briefcase wrote nothing down. He only said, "For national security reasons, Commander, none of this will be made public. Do you understand?" Armstrong hesitated. Then he nodded. Because he understood something larger than words, he was no longer in control of his own story. The redactions begin. Days later, the official Apollo 21 transcripts were released to the press. They contained Armstrong's famous line about a giant leap for mankind. They contained technical chatter about fuel reserves, landing velocity, oxygen levels. What they did not contain were the private channel communications between Armstrong and Aldrin about the figure on the horizon. Those lines were gone, deleted, as though they had never been spoken at all. The missing film. Rumors soon swirled among low-level NASA technicians. Some claimed they had seen film reels from lunar cameras showing something unusual beyond the landing site. Others swore entire frames of footage had been quietly removed before public release. One technician told a reporter years later, off the record, "I saw the original reels before they cut them down. There was something there. It wasn't a rock formation, it wasn't lens flare, and it wasn't human." The reporter asked if he had copies. The man laughed bitterly. "Copies? They took the originals, locked them away, probably burned them by now." White House intervention. In Washington, President Nixon held private meetings with NASA administrators and intelligence officials. The minutes of those meetings remain classified to this day. But one aide, speaking decades later, said Nixon viewed the entire incident as a national security threat, not because of what it was, but because of what it could do to the world if the truth ever surfaced. "We were in the middle of the Cold War," the aide said. "If something appeared on the moon that neither we nor the Soviets controlled, it would have been chaos. Religions would fracture, governments would panic. So Nixon did what Nixon always did. He buried it. Orders from above." By September 1974, every astronaut who had seen the figure had signed non-disclosure agreements under penalty of treason. The story of Apollo 21 became one of engineering excellence, American heroism, space-age optimism. Its darker truth was scrubbed from history, chalk from a blackboard. Armstrong, privately furious, told one NASA official, "You want me to say it was an illusion? But illusions don't leave footprints." The official only said, "History is what we write, Commander, not what we erase." The weight of secrecy. As the years passed, Armstrong withdrew from public life. He gave technical lectures about aeronautics, signed autographs, smiled politely at ceremonies. But the luminous figure remained locked behind his eyes and behind government vault doors, where transcripts, film reels, and medical reports were sealed under layers of security clearances. Aldrin hinted at it once, in an unguarded interview, before quickly changing the subject. Armstrong never spoke of it again publicly, because he knew the cost, and because the men who had taken the truth away from him were not asking, they were telling. Neil Armstrong was never the same after Apollo 21. The world saw the same modest, soft-spoken man. They always had a hero who smiled politely for cameras, who spoke carefully at ceremonies, who taught engineering students about flight mechanics with quiet precision. But behind closed doors, those closest to him saw the difference. He carried it in his eyes. The way he'd stop mid-sentence when a television newscaster mentioned the moon. The way he stared out the window at night, as though waiting for something only he could sense. The way he avoided questions he once might have answered eagerly. Janet Armstrong's worrying. His wife, Janet, noticed it first. Before Apollo 21, Neil had always been a man of measured words, but he talked. He shared small details about his day, told stories to their sons, discussed plans for the future. After the mission, conversations grew shorter. Sometimes he'd sit at the kitchen table for an hour without saying a word, his gaze fixed on the night sky. Janet once asked him what he was thinking about. He didn't look at her when he answered. "I keep wondering if it's still watching." She never asked again. The quiet isolation. Reporters hounded Armstrong for interviews about Apollo 21. He gave them the same polished answers every time. Yes, it was an honor. Yes, it was a success. Yes, it was the result of thousands of people's hard work. But when journalists asked about strange rumors, whispers of unusual sightings, or classified transcripts, his eyes hardened. "I have nothing to say about that," he told one reporter flatly, ending the interview on the spot. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Not fear of the truth itself, but of what the truth would do to a world that wasn't ready for it. Buzz Aldrin's hints. Buzz Aldrin, on the other hand, hinted more openly. In a 1980 interview, he mentioned there were things from the Apollo missions the public would never be told in our lifetimes. The interviewer pressed him for details. Aldrin smiled thinly and said, "Let's just say we weren't alone up there, and leave it at that." The network cut that segment before broadcast. The government's grip. Every few years, men from Washington would visit Armstrong quietly. Sometimes they wore NASA pins. Sometimes they didn't. They reminded him of the non-disclosure agreements. They reminded him that national security was bigger than personal conscience. One official, in a moment of rare candor, told him, "The Cold War would have turned hot overnight if this got out. Religion would have split in half. Governments would collapse. You saw something humanity isn't ready for, Commander. That's why you'll stay silent." Armstrong didn't argue, but in private letters to close friends' letters the government never found, he wrote lines like, "Maybe they're right. Maybe the world isn't ready. But then why do I feel like I betrayed the truth itself?" The weight of memory. In the late 1970s, Armstrong began teaching aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati. Students adored him, the first man to walk on the moon, explaining equations on a chalkboard like any other professor. But those who spent time with him noticed his silences. One former student recalled, he talked about thrust, trajectory, fuel consumption, but when someone asked what the moon looked like, he paused for the longest time. Then he said, "It looked back at me." And that was all. Family distance. His sons, Mark and Eric, grew up sensing there was something their father wasn't telling them. They remembered the way he sometimes stood alone in the backyard at night, hands in his pockets, staring at the moon as though expecting it to answer an unspoken question. Janet once told a friend, he came back alive, but part of him stayed up there. The astronauts packed. Buzz Aldrin once visited Armstrong privately in 1983. Over whiskey, he reportedly said, "I think about it every day, Neil. That thing, whatever it was. I can't decide if it was warning us or waiting for us." Armstrong didn't respond for a long time. Then he whispered, "Maybe both." Decades of silence. By the 1990s, the Apollo 21 files were so deeply buried under classification codes that even high-ranking NASA administrators couldn't access them without Pentagon clearance. Armstrong stopped granting interviews almost entirely. When pressed by biographers, he gave technical details about flight paths and landing procedures, but nothing about the figure on the moon, because the men who visited him every few years never stopped coming, and because the weight of that watchful presence never left his mind. Long before Apollo 21 touched lunar soil, humanity had already filled the moon with stories. The ancient Greeks saw Selene, the goddess with a silver crown, driving her chariot across the night sky. The Sumerians spoke of Nonna, the celestial father, whose light guided travelers through deserts and darkness. In China, legends told of Change, the moon maiden who lived in solitude among the stars. Across continents and centuries, the moon was never just a rock in the sky. It was a presence, a watcher, Some even called it a mirror of heaven reflecting not only sunlight, but the hidden forces shaping human destiny. The ancient warnings. In a fragment of Babylonian text, archaeologists found a chilling line. When the silver eye gazes without blinking, the kings shall tremble. At the time, scholars assumed it was metaphor, a poetic warning about eclipses, perhaps omens for rulers. But after Apollo 21, when whispers of a luminous figure on the moon began circulating in secret, some historians quietly wondered if the ancients had known something we didn't. Had early civilizations seen things modern science had forgotten? Echoes across cultures. The Mayans spoke of moon deities, watching humanity's rise and fall. Hindu texts described Chandra, the moon god, as a witness to both creation and destruction. Even the Bible carried echoes of the celestial unknown angels appearing in blinding radiance, beings not of this world delivering messages humanity could barely comprehend. Armstrong himself, in one of his few private reflections, wrote a single sentence hinting at this connection. If what we saw had appeared in ancient times, they would have called it a god. The parallels. The luminous figure described by Armstrong and Aldrin bore uncanny similarities to these mythic beings, radiance without source, like the burning ones in the book of Ezekiel, silence without threat like the watchers in apocryphal Hebrew texts, a sense of being judged as though weighed against some cosmic standard humanity could not see. Even Aldrin, usually the more skeptical of the two, admitted privately, it didn't feel alien, it felt old, older than anything we know. Whispers in NASA's halls. Some NASA employees began calling the figure the Sentinel in private conversations, though never in official reports. One technician, speaking decades later on his deathbed, said, "We thought we were exploring the moon. Turns out, maybe it was waiting for us." That phrase "waiting for us" appeared again and again in fragments of letters, in erased transcripts, in notes smuggled out before classification buried everything. It was as though those who glimpsed the truth could not shake the feeling of being expected. The fear of patterns. When government analysts reviewed myths about celestial beings appearing to ancient rulers, they found something unsettling. Civilizations often recorded a moment when the sky people, or the shining ones, descended, offered knowledge, then vanished. And always, after such encounters, came upheaval, new religions, new empires, sometimes even collapse. Was Apollo 21 another point on that same pattern? Was this why Nixon had demanded silence? Because he feared history repeating itself on a global scale. Armstrong's private marginalia. In the margins of one declassified notebook, likely Armstrong's, appeared a single cryptic line next to a sketch of the lunar horizon. The old stories weren't stories. Nothing else. No explanation. Just those 5 words, as though he'd written them quickly and shut the book before someone saw. Myth made flesh. If the luminous figure had appeared in Babylon, or Greece, or the Mayan Empire, priests would have built temples. If it had appeared in medieval Europe, churches would have declared a miracle or a heresy. But it appeared in 1974, before men with cameras, radios, computers and governments who saw not divinity, but danger. And so, unlike the ancients, modern humanity did not carve statues or write hymns. It wrote classified reports. It redacted transcripts. It locked film reels in underground vaults. Because to the modern mind, the sacred was just another security risk. The silence surrounding Apollo 21 was not unique. It was simply the latest chapter in humanity's long habit of locking away its own wonders. Cold War shadows. In the 1950s, long before Apollo missions began, American fighter pilots reported metallic discs outpacing their jets over the Pacific. The reports went straight to the Pentagon and straight into locked filing cabinets. When civilians asked, officials smiled politely and called them weather balloons. In 1967, radar stations in Canada tracked unidentified objects moving faster than any known aircraft. The Canadian government quietly handed the files to Washington. 2 years later, Apollo 11 astronauts privately reported unidentified lights following them in lunar orbit. NASA brushed it off as sunlight reflecting off booster panels, but not everyone believed that explanation. The UFO connection. By the early 1970s, the United States had launched Project Blue Book, a systematic investigation into UFO sightings. Publicly, it concluded most cases had conventional explanations. Privately, some investigators admitted at least 700 incidents remained unsolved objects seen by pilots, radar operators, even astronauts, that did not behave like weather balloons or swamp gas. One Air Force officer, interviewed decades later, said, "We explained away what we could. The rest we locked up, because the public wasn't ready." The phrase "the public wasn't ready" appeared again and again in declassified memos, as though ordinary people were children needing protection from the cosmic unknown. The men who knew too much. In 1985, a retired intelligence analyst claimed he had seen Apollo 21 transcripts before they were classified. He described a short, chilling phrase reportedly spoken by Armstrong about seeing the luminous figure. "It knows we're here." When asked why the public never saw that line, the analyst laughed without humor. "Because you can't control what comes after words like that." Patterns across time. Historians noticed the secrecy followed a pattern. 1908, Tunguska explosion in Siberia. Early witnesses described a fireball from heaven. Soviet records stayed sealed for decades. 1947, Roswell crash. Military claimed it was a weather balloon, even after officers admitted privately it wasn't. 1961, astronauts in low Earth orbit reported flashes moving against the stars. Transcripts vanished into classified archives. 1974, Apollo 21 luminous figure. Erased footage, redacted medical records, sealed debriefings. Each event followed the same arc. Witnesses speak, gives governments deny, gives files vanish, gives decades later. Fragments emerge to later matter. The weight of secrecy. One NASA engineer, speaking off record in 1991, said, "People think the cover-up now about fear of panic. It's not. It's about control. If something bigger than us shows up, governments stop being the biggest thing in the room, and that terrifies them." Armstrong seemed to sense this truth early on. In one private letter, never meant for public eyes, he wrote, "They fear what they can't own. That's why they bury it." The phenomenon Alpha Vault. Rumors circulated about a secure underground archive, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Apollo 21 materials were allegedly stored. Unedited telemetry data, private channel recordings, frames of film showing the luminous figure. No one outside top clearance ever saw inside the vault. When journalists filed Freedom of Information requests in the 1990s, the Air Force responded, "No records found," but retired officers hinted otherwise. One even claimed the vault contained artifacts retrieved from sites not of earthly origin. He refused to elaborate. Global silence. It wasn't just the United States. Soviet cosmonauts reported strange lights in orbit. Chinese scientists tracked objects moving against orbital paths. None of it reached public news outlets. Different governments, different languages, but the same silence. The larger pattern. By the time the Apollo program ended, researchers noticed the pattern extended beyond UFOs or lunar mysteries, nuclear accidents, spy satellite crashes, biological research failures. Whenever reality cracked open too far, official history quickly closed the gap, and Apollo 21 fit that template perfectly. Anomalous event witnessed by credible people. Evidence sealed under national security. Public story sanitized for mass consumption. Because secrets, once buried, stop being events. They become ghosts. Armstrong's reflection. In 1989, asked at a private dinner if he believed governments had hidden the full truth of Apollo 21, Armstrong reportedly said, "I think they hide more than people would believe, maybe more than even they believe." It was the closest he ever came to admitting what everyone suspected. The silence wasn't accidental, it was policy. The Apollo program was supposed to be only the beginning. By the late 1960s, NASA had drafted plans for lunar bases. By 1985, engineers imagined fleets of cargo landers, permanent habitats on the moon's surface, even missions to Mars before the century's end. The moon was to be humanity's first outpost beyond Earth. And then, after Apollo 21, everything stopped. The official story. The public was told it was about money. The space race was over. The Soviets had fallen behind. The United States had won. Why spend billions on more missions when there were wars to fight, oil crises to manage, economies to stabilize? It made sense on paper, but some within NASA whispered another reason. One scientist, speaking in retirement years later, said, "We didn't stop because we ran out of money. We stopped because we were told to stop." He never clarified who did the telling. The 1974 decision. In September 1974, barely 2 months after Apollo 21, a classified memorandum circulated among high-ranking NASA officials and White House staff. Its contents remain sealed to this day. But we know what happened next. Apollo 22, 23, and 24 were quietly cancelled. Lunar base proposals were shelved indefinitely. Funding shifted toward low Earth orbit projects, like the Space Shuttle. It was as though someone had slammed the brakes on humanity's march into space. The astronauts' silence. When asked in later years why America never returned to the moon, Armstrong gave vague answers about politics, priorities, and budgets. But privately, Buzz Aldrin once told a friend, "After what we saw, maybe they decided it was better to stay home." He never said who they were, or what exactly had convinced them. The Cold War factor. Some historians argue the timing wasn't coincidence. In 1974, the United States was still reeling from Vietnam, Watergate, and an arms race with the Soviet Union that drained billions. The last thing Washington wanted was a new unknown something beyond human control appearing on the moon, where superpower tensions already ran high. Because if Apollo 21 had found someone already there, it meant the moon wasn't empty real estate for flags and bases. It meant humanity wasn't the landlord of the solar system after all. The secret briefing. Rumors persist of a top-secret congressional briefing held in late 1974. One anonymous source claimed the meeting included NASA officials, military intelligence, and senior lawmakers. Its purpose: to discuss whether continued lunar exploration would lead to unmanageable disclosures. The phrase appears in a single leaked memo, authenticity unconfirmed, but its meaning feels clear enough. Someone feared that going back might reveal too much. The shift to silence. After Apollo 21, NASA's public tone changed subtly. Gone were the bold speeches about conquering space, colonizing planets, building cities on the moon. Instead came talk of low Earth orbit research, satellites, shuttles, sustainable exploration, safe things, predictable things, things that didn't risk astronauts stumbling into something governments couldn't control. The lunar ban theory. Conspiracy theorists argue the Apollo 21 encounter amounted to a warning, a silent message that humanity had crossed an unseen boundary. Some claim classified transcripts record Armstrong saying, "It looked at us the way a landlord looks at squatters." No such transcript has surfaced publicly, but the timing of Apollo's sudden end leaves a long shadow, because after 1974, humans never again set foot on the moon. Not Americans, not Soviets, no one. For 50 years. Armstrong's later words. In one rare interview near the end of his life, Armstrong said, "The moon will have its secrets long after we're gone." It sounded like poetry, but those who knew him best thought it sounded like something else. Resignation, as though he knew exactly what secret it held and why we had been told never to look too closely again. The decision to bury Apollo 21's truth wasn't made by machines or algorithms or some cold, inhuman bureaucracy. It was made by men with titles and clearance levels, men who smoked cigarettes in dark conference rooms, men who stared at blurred lunar photographs, at transcripts with words they didn't understand, and felt something they rarely admitted in public life. Fear. Fear of the unknown. The most powerful people on Earth lived in a world of categories, allies and enemies, communism and capitalism, weapons and treaties. But the luminous figure on the moon didn't fit any category. It wasn't Soviet. It wasn't American. It wasn't human. And that terrified them. Because power only works when you understand what you're controlling. And this thing, whatever it was, answered to no one on Earth. One intelligence official, speaking decades later under anonymity, said, "It wasn't about science. It was about survival. If we admitted there was something out there bigger than us, every system we built, governments, militaries, religions, would start to crack." He paused, then added, "People in power don't fear the unknown because it's dangerous. They fear it because it can't be owned." The politics of secrecy. Washington wasn't the first capital to bury inconvenient truths. The Soviets had hidden nuclear accidents for decades. The British kept wartime code-breaking secrets locked up until the 1970s. Even the Vatican had archives of celestial phenomena going back centuries, sealed under papal keys. Secrecy was power, and power rarely surrendered information willingly. After Apollo 21, the Nixon administration decided humanity wasn't ready to hear about what the astronauts saw. But maybe that was only half the story. Maybe it wasn't about humanity at all. Maybe it was about them, the men in the suits, realizing the universe didn't revolve around their empires after all. The psychological threat. Cold War psychologists studied what might happen if undeniable proof of non-human intelligence reached the public. Their reports made grim predictions. Religious schisms as faith struggled to adapt. Political instability as nations demanded access to the truth. Economic chaos if technology or artifacts hinted at energy sources beyond oil or nuclear power. One report concluded bluntly, the first casualty of disclosure would be trust in authority itself. And trust was the one thing governments could not afford to lose in the Cold War era. Armstrong's private notes. Armstrong seemed to understand this better than most. In one surviving note, he wrote, "It wasn't fear I felt up there, it was perspective. The kind that makes governments afraid, because it makes them small." He never explained what he meant. But those who read the line decades later understood perfectly. The weight of control. To men like Nixon, control was survival. Losing control of narratives, of secrets, of the very story humanity told about itself was unacceptable. So they classified, redacted, denied. Not because they had answers, but because they didn't. And admitting ignorance was more dangerous than any alien threat. The burden on witnesses. For Armstrong and Aldrin, the cover-up carried a personal cost. They had walked on the moon. They had seen something extraordinary. And then they were told to pretend it never happened. As Aldrin once told a confidant in the 1990s, it wasn't just the secrecy, it was the loneliness of it. We saw something the whole world would want to know, and we had to carry it like a locked coffin. Armstrong carried it even more quietly. He never gave interviews about the encounter, never hinted at it publicly, but friends said he sometimes grew distant mid-conversation, as though part of him was still standing on that grey horizon, staring at a figure that never moved, never spoke, but somehow changed everything. The silence of power. Governments claimed they buried the truth to protect humanity from fear, chaos, division. But perhaps the real reason was simpler. Perhaps they buried it because they didn't want to share it. Because power, once confronted with something greater than itself, always chooses silence over humility, and Apollo 21 confronted them with something far greater than power. Apollo 21 wasn't the only time trained, credible professionals saw things they weren't supposed to see. It was simply the time the world came closest to finding out. The Mercury lights. In 1962, during one of the early Mercury missions, astronaut John Glenn reported seeing a field of fireflies following his capsule in orbit. NASA explained it as ice crystals catching sunlight, but Glenn told fellow astronauts privately they moved like they had a purpose. His comments were left out of official transcripts. The Gemini anomaly. 3 years later, during Gemini 7, astronauts reported an object pacing their craft 4 to full orbits. NORAD confirmed nothing else was in that airspace. The incident was logged, filed, and classified before the astronauts even returned to Earth. One technician who handled the data said years later, "It didn't behave like debris. It maneuvered, The file disappeared into Air Force archives. The Apollo 11 interference. Even Apollo 11, humanity's first lunar landing, carried whispers of missing transmissions. Amateur radio operators claimed to intercept private channel chatter between Armstrong and Houston describing to large objects watching from the crater's edge. NASA dismissed it as hoaxes, but one ham radio operator swore until his deathbed he heard Armstrong say, "They're here. They're watching us." The Soviet encounters. While the United States buried its own anomalies, the Soviet Union had similar problems. Cosmonaut Viktor Afanasyev claimed he saw a structured object trailing his craft in 1979. When he landed, KGB agents confiscated his flight recordings. Afanasyev said, "They told me to forget what I saw. I never did." Pilot testimonies. Military pilots reported the same patterns. Objects outpacing jets over the Atlantic. Bright disks over nuclear silos in Montana. Cigar-shaped craft over the Pacific tracked on radar, but never appearing on civilian news reports. One Air Force major said bluntly, "We see them. We just don't talk about them." The astronaut who hinted too much. In 1994, Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, publicly stated he believed governments were hiding evidence of extraterrestrial contact. "We are not alone," he told reporters, and the secrecy runs deep. NASA quickly distanced itself from his remarks. Mitchell doubled down anyway, saying, "The cover-up is not just military, it's cosmic." Patterns in silence. Across decades and continents, the same story repeated. Professional witnesses saw things they couldn't explain. Their reports vanished into classified archives. Their careers continued as long as they stopped talking. Those who didn't stop talking were labeled unreliable, delusional, or publicity-seeking, because official history prefers silence to mystery. The fragmented record. Occasionally, scraps escaped classification. Declassified CIA files mentioning unidentified aerial phenomena near U.S. missile sites. Old Air Force memos noting objects of unknown origin over the Arctic. A single NASA photo frame from Apollo 16 showing a glowing shape near the lunar horizon before later missions stopped releasing raw images to the public. Each fragment on its own seemed meaningless. Together, they painted a picture no one in power wanted assembled. Armstrong's reaction. When asked in the 1980s about these other sightings, Armstrong said carefully, "I can't speak to other reports, but I know silence doesn't mean nothing happened." It was the closest he ever came to solidarity with the witnesses who hinted and paid for it in credibility. Neil Armstrong became a symbol of human achievement, but privately, he remained a prisoner of the moon. The man who had walked where no human had walked before now lived a life defined by silence. The reluctant hero. Unlike many astronauts who embraced fame, Armstrong withdrew from public life. He turned down speaking tour, refused political office, rarely gave interviews. When he did speak publicly, his words were measured, technical, almost painfully modest. But friends noticed a change in him after Apollo 21. One former NASA colleague said, "He wasn't haunted in the way people imagine. It wasn't fear. It was weight, like he was carrying something too big for words." The lost interviews. Journalists begged him for Apollo 21 stories. They got engineering details, mission timelines, training anecdotes, but never the encounter. One reporter asked directly about rumors of anomalies on the moon. Armstrong froze, then said softly, "Some things belong to the moon, not to history books." The interview ended minutes later. Letters that never reached print. In the 1980s, Armstrong wrote occasional letters to close friends, not about politics or science, but about philosophy, mortality, and what he called the vastness behind the veil. One fragment found after his death read, "People think space is silent because there's no air. That's not why. It's silent because it holds too much for words." Another, scribbled in a margin, "I think we saw something the ancient prophets would have recognized and the modern world would destroy." The NASA veterans. As the Apollo era faded into history, other retired astronauts and NASA officials hinted quietly about classified moments never revealed to the public. Some refused to elaborate out of loyalty. Others feared the ridicule that came with speaking too much. One flight surgeon, long retired, said in 2001, "Armstrong told me what he saw. I believe him. And I understand why he stopped talking about it." When pressed for details, the man only shook his head. The final years. By the 2000s, Armstrong lived quietly in Ohio. Neighbors described him as polite, private, devoted to family, but often seen at night in his backyard, telescope pointed at the moon, as though keeping vigil. His son Mark once told a journalist, "Dad never lost interest in space. He just lost interest in talking about it." The sealed archives. When Armstrong died in 2012, NASA released tributes, documentaries, and commemorative stamps. What they didn't release were his private notes, the ones seized after Apollo 21, locked in government archives under layers of classification. Those pages remain sealed. Some rumors claim they contain descriptions of the luminous figure in language so stark, so unsettling, officials feared the public reaction. Others say the notes are more poetic than factual reflections of a man trying to reconcile science, faith, and something beyond both. The whispered confession. At a private dinner in 2005, attended by several former astronauts, Armstrong reportedly said, "One day the truth will come out, but not while men like us are alive." It was the closest he ever came to confession, and those present said his voice carried neither bitterness nor fear, only resignation. The legacy he left behind. To the world, Neil Armstrong was a pioneer, a hero, a symbol of courage and exploration. But to those who knew him best, he was also a man who bore a secret so heavy it shaped the rest of his life. A secret about the moon, about what waits there, about why, for 50 years, no one has gone back. The moon keeps its secrets well. 50 years have passed since Apollo 21, since the men looked across the barren horizon and saw something that should not have been there. And still, the silence holds, the truth buried with them. Armstrong carried it to his grave in 2012. Buzz Aldrin, now one of the last men alive who was there, remains careful with his words even today. Government files stay sealed. Transcripts remain redacted. Film reels rumored to show the luminous figure sit in vaults. No journalist will ever enter. The truth exists somewhere, but buried beneath layers of secrecy, thick as lunar dust. The world that wasn't ready. Officials always claimed it was about preventing panic, that humanity wasn't ready to learn it wasn't alone, that religions would fracture, politics would implode, economies would shatter. But perhaps the truth was simpler. Perhaps the ones in power weren't ready, because the moment the story left their control, so would the illusion that they ruled the world. One declassified memo from the late 1970s carried a single chilling sentence: "The first nation to admit they are not alone will be the first to lose authority over their own people." No wonder the silence held. Armstrong's last words on the matter. In one of his final public appearances, speaking at a university in 2011, Armstrong told students, "There are great ideas still undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers." Most assumed he was speaking about science, but some in the audience wondered if the old astronaut was hinting at something else entirely, another protective layer wrapped not around nature's mysteries, but humanity's own secrets. The philosopher's question. Historians, theologians, and philosophers have long debated what it would mean if proof of non-human intelligence appeared before us. Would religions collapse or find validation? Would nations unite or fight harder over cosmic territory? Would we feel small or finally connected to something larger than ourselves? Apollo 21 never answered those questions. It only raised them, then locked them away. The cosmic perspective, Armstrong once wrote, in a fragment smuggled out of his private papers. "We went looking for the moon. Instead, we found a mirror held up to mankind, and we looked away first." That sentence alone carries the weight of everything Apollo 21 left behind. The encounter wasn't just about what they saw. It was about what it revealed about us. Our fear, our secrecy, our hunger for control, even over things too big to own. If the luminous figure was real, if it watched the Apollo 21 crew with that silent, measuring gaze, then it has been watching us all along, through our wars, our politics, our endless debates about who controls what. And perhaps it is still waiting, not for rockets or flags or technology, but for us to grow up. One day, someday, maybe, the archives will open, the redacted lines will clear, the film reels will roll and cut. The words Armstrong and Aldrin spoke on that private channel will reach the public exactly as they were said in 1974, and humanity will finally hear the story the moon has been keeping for half a century. Until then, only fragments remain. A whisper in a retired technician's interview, a line in a private notebook, a sentence spoken over whiskey at a gathering of old astronauts, pieces of a truth too vast for the age that first glimpsed it. The final image. Armstrong once told a friend late in life, "People ask if I was afraid up there, but it didn't feel like fear. It felt like standing in a cathedral older than time." And maybe that's what the moon really was to him in the end. Not a destination, not a victory, but a temple whose door we opened for a moment, and then locked behind us before we understood what we'd entered. The story of Apollo 21 isn't just about astronauts and aliens, or secrets and politics. It's about humanity itself. About our instinct to explore colliding with our fear of what we might find. About how power chooses silence when wonder might weaken its grip. About how truth waits patiently for the moment when we're finally ready to hear it. Maybe Armstrong was right. Some truths really do have protective layers, and maybe, just maybe, the universe is waiting for us to be brave enough to peel them away.